James Winchester, who is our subject tonight, was one of those people who passes through history as an enigma. His role, as we look at his role in our community and in the nation, baffles the historian of early American history. He associated with giants. He associated with George Washington and Anthony Wayne and James Madison and Nathaniel Greene, his associate William Henry Harrison, Andrew Jackson. But yet nowhere in the general history text or the general survey of history does his name come out and stand in front of us like those gentlemen. Why? Even his presence in Defiance is just a pass-through. He's not here even a year. But he did leave his mark here and was very important to the very settlers of our community, the first of the pioneers who came in the 1818, 1819, and 1820. Because that fort he built to supply Harrison's activities at Fort Meigs, that fort became the lumber supply for the first pioneers of our community, and I doubt out of the 8 or 9 homes that were built in the early time, almost all of them had timber from Fort Winchester that had been cut and honed for them. So he plays an important role in our community. And our first settlers certainly appreciated what he did. Tonight, we're going to jointly explore the life of General James Winchester. Now, my role in tonight's program will be the prober, and maybe his defender will take the place of Mr. Rozevink, because I have some questions. You see, I can't get out of my mind that 3 times this man surrendered his army to the British. Once in the American Revolution and twice in the War of 1812. And it's kind of hard to justify that this guy's a hero who keeps giving up his army. Now, I know Mr. Rozevink might have a different opinion, and we're going to let him go, but I have begged with him that I have the right to interfere and ask him questions anytime I want to. The one thing we want you to do, though, is at the end, we want you to ask us questions, not only about James Winchester, but about that fort that we seem to forget because we like Anthony Wayne's fort much better. So if you have any questions about the role of Fort Winchester, how it was built, etc., please feel free at the end of our program to join in. So at this time, it is my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Rich Rozevink, who's going to start out with James Winchester, Tennessee gentleman and general.
Good evening. Everybody can hear us playing, I hope. If not, we can make some adjustments on the volume. James was born February the 6th, 1752 in Westminster, Maryland. Westminster, Maryland was a town that his father laid out. His father came from England. James was one of the first generations to be born in America. The homestead that they lived in was called White Level. They were pretty well-to-do people, also within the Frederick County of Maryland. His father served in the French and Indian War, was very patriotic. And as the Revolutionary War started, they organized a group to screen the locals for potentially to be members in the militia and such. James, he ends up joining the militia as a private, and that's where my first rank is, or his first rank would be as a private in 1st Battalion of the Frederick County Militia and the 3rd Maryland Regiment. James fights with Washington's army at the Battle of Long Island in 1776, and he was part of what they called a flying camp. A flying camp, research I've found, is much like a home guard is today. Your primary military leaves, your National Guard leaves, and there's a home guard, people that are assigned to protect the women and children and the different buildings and such like this, and that's where they get the term flying camp. They were very dedicated. They ranged from the age of 15 to 50. Many of them were good marksmen, and you could see that he served was at the battles of Harlan Heights, White Plains, and Fort Washington, and at that point he moves from a private rank to a junior officer, lieutenant. He worked with General Sullivan during this campaign. Right in this area right here, they made a crossing into the island of Staten Island. There was a group of Tory men there, and they captured them. They had a lack of boats. They got most of the army across and brought the Tories back, but James and his unit acted as a rear guard to protect the main American force. And that's the first time I get captured, he gets captured. But he was doing an honorable thing. He was providing a service, being a rear guard for the main force.
Yeah, but as a commanding officer, a man of that rank, wouldn't he have thought that even though he's a rear guard, that he should have had the equipment to get his men out?
Well, if you study that particular battle of Staten Island, they were short of boats, and he more or less was the short end of the stick or else volunteered. I'm not sure, it's not really stated, but he was left behind with his unit to act as a rear guard.
So he surrendered his entire force.
Well, his company. It didn't say how many people it was. And at this point, he was captured by the British and was imprisoned. He would be in prison for the next 3 years, and he didn't come out of that until 1780. The fortunate thing about James Winchester at this time, he was at the officer level. During the Revolutionary War, the British didn't treat this common soldier very well. They didn't want to call him a prisoner of war for the fact that they didn't want to acknowledge, if they did that, then they would acknowledge that the colonies were another nation. They didn't want to get into that. The common man, they had 15 by the end of the war. They had 15 old men of war ships out in the New York Harbor, and a lot of deaths occurred there. They said that they would actually drop the bodies overboard, or else they would bury them along the shore of the bay. There was some estimate there was like 10,000 American soldiers were killed or died on those prison ships. But being an officer, he was treated better, because the British didn't want their officers treated harshly either. So he had a little bit better accommodations than the regular person. Doing the research, his father tried to contact him several times. They exchanged letters and such like this, trying to get him released.
Now, he had some combat before. Oh, that's what surprised me. You've got a picture of him now going down to Yorktown.
Well, he was released in December 22nd of 1780, and he spent Christmas at home, and he immediately rejoined the American line. In other words, the regiments of the state of Maryland. And he was back into service on January 1st, 1781, and he was placed in the Southern Command with General Nathaniel Greene. At that time, Greene was in charge of all the the military troops from Delaware south, and Maryland fell within his realm of command.
Now, it's under Greene that Wayne, at the end of the war, like Winchester, is in the southern...
Yes, Wayne is down there at that point. As far as I can determine, they never had any physical contact because neither one of them participated in the different battles.
Okay.
Wayne was moved to the Southern Command, and he was his Pennsylvania troops, his corps, was taken away from him, which he didn't like, but he was like a quick reaction mounted group that struck the different positions and such. As you can see, that's the Battle of Yorktown. That was pretty much the turning of the war when we defeated Cornwallis down there. He would, during this time, he was commissioned as a captain in February of 1782, and he served in the military until November 15th, 1783. He had a brother. He had numerous brothers, but it talks more to I think his older brother George. There was a brother James. They were all in the military, but basically James and George, and this was the Order of Cincinnati. This was a military order that was organized in the different colonies or states at the time, and it's named after a Roman hero, Quintus Cincinnatus. He was an ordinary citizen in Rome. He dropped his plow basically and went and defended his country, and when the battles were over with, he returned back to being a private citizen. And that's what they foresaw. You know, these patriots did the same thing. They went and served their country and then returned to civilian life.
A lot of the guys on the Ohio frontier were members of the Cincinnatus group because Arthur St. Clair, who was the governor of this area, and of course probably one of the reasons one of our cities in southern Ohio got labeled Cincinnati in honor of this very organization, which Winchester was one of the early. Okay, good, good for him.
And it was quite a prestigious award given to those early officers and such. After the Revolutionary War, James settled in the Cumberland Valley of what would become Tennessee, and he fought with the different Indian tribes that were there, the Creeks, the Cherokees, Chickasaws, Shawnees. Basically what they were doing was settling on former hunting grounds. And James, he was appointed lieutenant colonel. He was the commander of the regiment of Sumter County, and so his rank was even higher, but he was still a militia grade at that point. And
so they used militia then to do the fighting with the Indians in the southern part of our country. Okay.
Yeah, see, then eventually that breaks off from Virginia and becomes a state of its own. And in that time period, I think his brother George was killed by the Indians.
Oh, he lost his brother's life there.
Yes, and the Indians pretty much was no longer a threat in our area. Naturally, everybody knows of Anthony Wayne and the Battle of Wallen Timbers. He broke the control of the Indians, and that filtered down into the southern part there. That they no longer, after the military victories of Harmer and Sinclair, they were no longer invincible, so they quit fighting, and there was peace came to that area. But the Indians actually settled in the western portion of the state of Tennessee.
So it is his conducting campaigns against the Indians that he caught the attention of Andrew Jackson, who was really the top dog in that whole. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
During this time period, Winchester was basically Andrew Jackson's #1 aide. The governors of Tennessee during that time period of 1796 to 1812, called him one of their most dependable field commanders.
And this is Jackson talking about Winchester because of what he did in the Tennessee Territory and
Yes.
so forth.
He had a reputation as an Indian fighter.
Okay.
And there's a picture of his house that was built in 1802, and they used the Tennessee limestone for the face of it. It was very, in 1802, that's quite a structure. It was setting on top of a hill.
Now, does that still exist?
Yes, it does. We'll get into that later. But he was, basically, he was, for his service to his country, he was given $2,300 and 250 acres. And he was able to buy another several thousand acres, him and his family, that they had quite a compound down there. Then we come to the War of 1812, in that time period. President Madison there declared war on Great Britain in July of 1812. They needed a good man in this area in the West, and Madison chose him and appoints him as a brigadier general of the U.S. Army. And his orders were to recruit and equip an army in the West to fight. Harrison, at this time, a year before this, fought a battle in the territory of Indiana, which he was the governor of Indiana at the time. It's called Tippecanoe, and he basically took the village that Prophet, Tecumseh's brother, and destroyed that. He kind of set the schedule off for Tecumseh because he was out recruiting the Indians and trying to unite them into a common front, and he told his brother not to fight, but yet he did, and Harrison was victorious there. Well, not every war, you might declare a war, but you don't know how it's going to turn out. The main British fort or area up in here was Fort Detroit, and they had sent General Hall to occupy Detroit and possibly invade Canada, or what would become Canada. And his plans were placed on a schooner on Lake Erie, and the British captured it. They knew his plans. Hall was kind of a, not that I was myself, but a retread from the Revolutionary War, and didn't have this fighting spirit. And Harrison, kind of a hot blood, you might say, took a number of troops from Kentucky and Tennessee to go to Fort Detroit.
Now,
to
these
relieve
Winchester troops that he...
Winchester was recruiting troops and trying to get these people into the army, into a militia, and Harrison takes off with a quantity of these people to help Fort Detroit. On his way, he gets the news that Fort Detroit has fallen, and that basically emboldens the Indians, because if you know the story of Fort Detroit, there was some preliminary battles before Brownstown and such like this, but the actual the fort itself was taken without firing a shot.
Yeah.
And the bad thing about it was at that time during the war that they dictated the terms, and the British said that all the American forts were to surrender, and if you were a combat person for the United States, you could not fight after that. You'd had until you were properly exchanged. Harrison, he changes his plans. He goes to Fort Wayne, relieves Fort Wayne of the Indian attack.
Now, Fort Wayne is the one that Wayne built when he was out here, right? Same fort?
Same area, yes.
Yeah, okay.
There is a fort over there, my understanding, but this is an 1816 version, so the Fort Wayne that we're talking about would have looked different than what you see there now.
Okay.
During that time, Harrison's in Fort Wayne. He's victorious. Winchester sees it is spurred on by the president because he's a brigadier general. He catches up with Harrison at Fort Wayne and relieves him of command. Said, I am the commander of the army.
That didn't go with William Henry.
No, he left. He took Colonel Johnson and 1,000-some mounted troops and went back to Kentucky and started lobbying. He knew how the political strings of the governors down there in Kentucky and Tennessee, and he got his rank equal to Winchester, brigadier general, and he was actually appointed the commander of the Army of the Old Northwest.
So Harrison now is superseding Winchester.
Yes, he is. But they have equal rank, but Harrison
They're the
is
same rank.
But Harrison is in command.
And now what does Harrison do once he gets command? Is he still down around Piqua or Cincinnati?
That's where he's at. While Winchester slowly makes his way towards the old Fort Defiance. He leaves in September, and he builds a series of camps along the way. And when he comes into Defiance, what presently is Defiance County, that's where he runs up against the British.
Is this where Muir is?
Yes, this is where Muir is coming up the south side of the Maumee River. He has 800 some Indians, 400 British regulars, and cannons. He was anticipating that he was going to lay siege to Fort Wayne and capture that fort.
That's one of our fables of Defiance, folks. Muir is in command of a British force that's come down from Detroit, and what we have is the battle at the confluence that never happened. The British had a large supply of support from the Native Americans, and in the process, didn't one of them get captured, one of Winchester's men?
Well, first off, they lost Ensign Ligon and a group of Kentucky militia in around Delaware Township. They were killed, and that's what Winchester was still in what we call Paulding County at the time. He advanced into what we call Defiance County now and crossed over to the south side of the river. In that point, his quartermaster, Sergeant McCoy, was captured.
Yes.
And McCoy was kind of like they always say, loose lips sinks the ship. Well, he talked quite a bit, and come to find out, there was another American army coming up the Au Glaize, and the Indians were aware of this because they were using signal cannons. The Indians knew there was another American force. So McCoy says, well, we got 3,000 men here in the group that I'm from. We've got another 2,500 coming up the Au Glaize, and William Henry Harrison is coming in from the east with a like number, like 9,000 troops you're going to face if you stay here. Well, the Indians didn't like the odds. The Indians decided that it wasn't bad when they were up against their forces, up against the Americans, the first with Winchester. But when they decided that they was outnumbered 3-1, they started dropping off, and basically Muir was by himself with 400 regulars, and I read his correspondence back to his headquarters. He says, the cannons aren't much good in the woods. They can't fire. They should be in an open field. And he said that one volley and I'd be wiped out. So he left.
Now, part of the fable of Defiance is that when Muir retreated back toward Fort Detroit, he dumped one of the cannons in the Maumee River. And I would venture to say over the years, there have been everywhere from 15 to 20 young men who have spent time on the bottom of the Maumee River looking for Muir's cannon. Now, it's never been found, but there's always hopes in the mind of our exploratory and creative young men of Defiance that someday they're going to find it. And those of us who realize that Muir did not and would not destroy his cannon kind of feel this is a part of our fable.
But
Muir's cannon is in the bottom of the Maumee River.
There's some truth to that. The cannon was dumped over by Shawnee Glen in that area.
Yeah.
And the advancing Americans pulled it out of the water.
Oh.
They
forgot to put that part of the story in for the young, enthusiastic men of Defiance.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
See, even when they put in a retaining wall around Fort Defiance, they claimed they hit a cannon at that point.
Yeah, but see, that was before.
Right.
The thing that fascinates me, even before I came to this fair city, I knew about Muir's cannon in the bottom of the Maumee River, and I was ready to get some diving goggles and do some things to see if I could become an explorer, but I talked to Louis Simonis and he straightened me out.
Oh, did he?
Yeah.
Louis is a good man. Basically, Winchester, once he's here in Defiance, he gets close to the confluence. He sends a message to Harrison, says, hey, I'm running low on supplies, there are Indians here, I need your help. Well, Harrison, by this time now, he's in command of the Army. He brings up a unit up the Au Glaize. He camps just outside of our corporation limits with his troops. Winchester's troops are in rebellion.
Yeah, they sure were.
They're Kentucky troops. They don't like a Tennessee retread, basically, the old warrior. They have a lack of food and proper clothing, and they were in open revolt, and they were going to go home. They were going to quit fighting. And all of a sudden, in amongst their midst, Harrison appears. And he tells them how dishonorable they would be if they would leave at this point, and forever their in-laws would be tainted, basically. So they decided to stay. Harrison again orders a fort to be built, and that fort starts on October I think around the 1st of October, and they have, as you can see, it was a sizable fort. It's over 600 feet by 120 some feet. They had over 500 and some men working on this, and the blockhouses were 20-foot square, if I don't recall, with a 24-foot overhang on top of that.
Right.
There was in this area right here, there was a hospital in there, and also warehouses or storage units, all made out of rough-hewed logs, as they said. And they said this was Atherton said this is the most beautiful fort he's ever seen. And
now, what was the fort built for?
the fort was actually as a forward outpost and supply depot. That's what it turned out to be. Mm-hmm. It was kind of curious, the fact that they started on the 1st of October, and according to Darnell, we know their journals and stuff like this, it was finished on October the 19th. By the time of October 19th, Winchester was in camp number 2 and going to camp number 3.
No.
He had moved on because that was his...
Where's camp number 2?
Camp number 2 would be just off the stage over here. It's over there by the golf course.
Okay.
And camp number 3 is out there by the Independence Dam now. But Winchester, he's taken his command down the river, and it's still his main thrust is to capture Detroit. And Darnell says on the 19th, the fort was completed, and it was christened Fort Winchester.
Now, was that done to kind of smooth over the feelings between Harrison and Winchester?
I think so, yes. He wanted to see a good...
Well, if the guy's mad at you, name a fort after him, and he'll let you get away with a few things.
There was much suffering in this area here because of the lack of supplies and the weather. They were in the middle of the Black Swamp, in September and October, November.
He had a lot of casualties, didn't he?
He lost hundreds of men here.
And just from freezing and malnutrition
Right.
and so forth. Real tragedy in our area.
One person that he lost is buried right up there. You might want to talk about Captain Johnny Logan a little bit to us.
Well, the one thing that Winchester is known for among the Native Americans is he took a young Shawnee Indian who was a nephew of Tecumseh and converted him into a spy and a scout. And he sent young Johnny Logan up towards what is now Toledo to reconnaissance the British forces and what was going on. And in that process, he was discovered, and in resistance to the British captives, he was severely wounded. And finally, here at Fort Winchester, Johnny Logan died. He was buried here, but the thing that the Native Americans today, when they come back to our community, are always looking for, where is the grave of Johnny Logan? And Johnny Logan's grave is within the fort. And if you go there, there's now a tombstone there that we put there. The Shawnee Nation came back to our community to honor this site because, you see, Johnny Logan was the first Native American that was buried with U.S. military honors in the state of Ohio. And this was all done by the compassion of Winchester to what Johnny Logan had done and what he sacrificed. So when we come back to Defiance, Fort Defiance is one thing to the Native Americans because that's where they got beat. But Fort Winchester to them is more significant to their world because that's where Johnny Logan is buried, who is still among the heroes of the Native American culture, especially the Shawnee, the Eastern Shawnee. So it's kind of irony. We honor our group and they honor then this man that was made a hero mainly because of the efforts of James Winchester.
The interesting thing with the research, Lieutenant George Croghan comments, he writes a letter to his father. Croghan was with the 17th U.S. Infantry, and he was helped complete this fort. And he writes his father that I have but 50 men here, and the main force is 6 miles away. I hope that the Indians do not attack me. Could you imagine a 600 by 150 or 125 foot fort like that with only 50 some men in it? You couldn't very well defend it, could you?
Croghan gets his reputation not here, but at Fort Stephenson over in Fremont, Ohio, when he defends it against Tecumseh and the British fort that comes down to take it after they had failed twice to capture Fort Meigs up at Perrysburg. So Croghan is a hero in the in the War of 1812, but he was deserted here by Winchester in the middle of the stronghold of the Indians with only 50 men to protect that fort. So I don't think Winchester gets many votes from Croghan.
He was just following orders.
Yeah, okay, all right.
Winchester was ordered by Harrison to go to the rapids, and that's basically Maumee. They had sent a General Tupper up in that area, and he kind of refused to go into that area. When the Indians became emboldened, a lot of the settlers had left that area, and they were standing corn. And Winchester was supposed to go there and gather that corn and defeat his army. And while he was at Grand Rapids, there was some people that came from Frenchtown, and that's what we call Monroe, Michigan now. The Indians were raiding the area and threatening them, and they pled their case to Winchester. Winchester, against standing orders, advances to Frenchtown. His main force stays back the rapids, and he sets one Kentucky militia ahead of him. They're successful on January the 18th. There's a battle. They defeat the Indians and drive the British back. They sustain about, I'd say, almost 10% casualties. So it wasn't. It was a pretty good fight.
Good success.
And so Winchester advances with his main force, and he sends a note to Harrison. And Harrison says to him, hold the ground at any rate. That was his orders. He was to come to relieve him or reinforce him. Once he's there, and in my estimation, there's where Winchester stayed in a private house. There's where his army was, right up here.
And this is at Monroe, right?
Right, and there's the British right there. On the morning of the 22nd, the guards or the pickets woke up, rubbed their eyes, looked out, and there was the British standing across the open field. And it said that one of the Americans fired one shot and killed a British soldier as they were advancing and the battle was on. These troops right in here were in amongst the buildings, and they had gardens there. And being in the frontier like this, they used a lot of heavy timber to protect the gardens from wild critters and such, and that's where they encamped. Well, the Scots unit, which was the 17th U.S. Infantry, which Croghan was part of, but he wasn't necessarily there, encamped to the right of them. And they came in late at night, and they never put up any breastworks or any protection at all. And on the 22nd, when the British attacked at dawn, they were the first group to retreat, in full retreat. There were several of militia captains took out troops to try to rally them, and they were killed also. There was one in particular that I portrayed at one time. His name was Allen, and with the 1st Rifle Regiment. He ends up getting killed trying to rally the troops. While this is going on, Winchester did another bad thing. He didn't issue the troops sufficient ammunition. They only had 5 to 10 rounds in their cartridge boxes. His main powder supply was back with him at this point right here. Not to defend him, but I would think, you talk about these troops. They walked from Kentucky. They start out in July and August, and they walk all the way up to northwest Ohio. They're here in January of 1813 with snow up to their knees. They come into a community. There's houses, there's warmth, there's women, there's cider, and plenty of food. They let their guard down, especially Winchester. He's taken advantage of his rank. He's in a private house, too far away from his troops. He doesn't advance enough powder, and he gets captured.
In some of the research that I did, it's inferred that Winchester was warned that the British were coming, and he ignored, didn't believe the source of that warning.
The locals told him that the British were forming and such, and yes, he didn't acknowledge that and didn't put up extra guards and such. There's a picture of the troops, what they looked like, ragtag with blankets wrapped around them. They're still in their linen uniforms and such like this. But they put up a good fight. There in one particular place, I'll take it back. Right up in here, there was this one unit after, right in this area right here, when Winchester was captured, they still were putting up a pretty good fight. His name was Madison, no relation to the president. And the only trouble was they were running low on ammunition. They had very few casualties amongst themselves. They had the British at that point were complaining because Once they were down, the Americans continued to shoot at them while they were on the ground. If they were trying to crawl back to their lines, the Americans were shooting at them. They thought that was very inhumane that we would continue to shoot at them. And they were holding their own. That was the only part of the battle that actually was successful. It said that Winchester had his son with him, a young son, a teenage son with him. He was captured along with Winchester by the Wyandotte Indian chief Roundhead. In what we've read the different journals, I think that Proctor was the commander of the British troops.
Yes.
He had his nose bloodied pretty good. He had a lot of casualties, and all of a sudden up comes this Indian chief with the opposing commander as a prisoner of war.
Now, Roundhead Village, if you go to Columbus on 117, you'll go through the community called Roundhead, and that's where his village was, and he had been recruited by Tecumseh and the Indians to join the British forces. The thing that I've always chuckled when I look at this picture is the story, if you go out west and talk to the Shawnee and the Wyandottes, and Roundhead was a Wyandotte, Roundhead captured Winchester, stripped him, and then took him to Proctor and forced him to surrender. And that doesn't seem to get into our history books too much, but when you talk to the Native American history, that's very much a part of their history at the Battle of River Raisin, which this is called.
Oh, Roundhead, to get him, he was a primary lieutenant of Tecumseh. Tecumseh and Roundhead were killed at the Battle of Thames by Harrison.
Yep.
In later on in the war. Anyhow, I've got a dispatch that Winchester wrote to the Secretary of War, and this is January the 23rd, 1813. And if you want to listen to the battle, if you want to listen, you can listen to it in his own words. And this is how he wrote to Armstrong, the Secretary of War. He said, a detachment of the west wing of the Western Army under my command at Frenchtown on River Raisin was attacked on the 22nd by a force great superior in number, aided by several pieces of artillery. The action commenced at dawn of the day. The picket guard were driven in, and heavy fire opened on the whole line, and by which part thereof was thrown into disorder, and being ordered to retire a small distance in order to form a more advantaged ground. I found the enemy doubling our left flank with force and rapidity. A destructive fire was sustained for some times at length and borne down on the few that remained with the party that retired from the line submitted. The remainder of our force in number, about 400, continued to defend themselves with gallant valor in an unequal contest against small arms and artillery until I was brought in as a prisoner to that part of the field occupied by the enemy. At that later place, I understood that our troops were defending themselves in a state of desperation, and was informed by the commanding officer of the enemy that he would afford them an opportunity of surrendering themselves prisoners of war, to which I acquiesced or acceded. I was more than ready to make the surrender, from being assured that unless done quickly, the building adjacent would be immediately set on fire, and that no responsibility would be taken for the conduct of the savages, who were then assembling in great numbers. At this critical situation, being desirous to preserve the lives of a number of our brave fellows who still held out, I sent a flag to them and agreed with the commanding officer of the enemy that they should surrender as prisoners of war on condition of being protected from the savages, allowed to retain their private property, and having their sidearms returned to them. It was impossible for me to ascertain for certainty the loss of which we sustained in this action from the impracticability of knowing the number who had escaped. 35 officers and about 487 commissioned officers and privates are prisoners of war. A list of names and officers is here and enclosed to you. Our losses are considerable. However, unfortunate it may seem the affair of yesterday, I am flattered by the belief that no material error is chargeable upon myself, and that this less censure is still less censure is deserved by the troops that I had the honor of commanding. With the exception of the portion of our forces which was thrown into disorder, no troops have ever behaved with more discipline and tripity. And that was what he had sent to after he was captured. The sad part of it was that after he was captured and taken back to Malden on the Canadian side, there was a number of American prisoners remained behind. And the British promised they didn't have enough sleds and vehicles to get them properly evacuated off the battlefield because they had an equal number of wounded troops. They left them there. Another group of Indians, and they think they came in from the Great Lakes. It was not possibly the same Indians that attacked the group, came in with a vengeance. The next day they came in and slaughtered a lot of those troops. They killed them. The ones that they could make slaves in, they took them away. The ones they couldn't, they put them in houses and burned them alive. And that became the battle call, Remember the Raisin. And the Kentucky troops, after that, when they went into battle, when they fought the Indians, they always hollered Remember the Raisin as a battle cry, and that actually helped win the war.
90% of Winchester's force that were engaged in this battle were either killed or captured. It's the highest fatality rate I think we've had in any single battle. Not the largest number, but the highest percentage of the troops that were failed.
One interesting thing in there that I probably should go back to that. One interesting thing was that, you know, that I had said that Harrison told him to hold the ground at all costs. Harrison was coming from the east, and on the day of the battle he was within 15 miles of Winchester, but he made no chance to try to advance into that area, and he retreated back to what would be the rapids there.
Now Winchester is incarcerated again, right?
Yes, he was in jail for a year and a half. I don't know exactly where he was kept. What material I have on Winchester doesn't really say. But he, again, after he's released by the British, he joins the military again. And this time he's sent into the South again, and he runs up against his old friend Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, the British fleet has been in the area for several months. He knows there's going to be a major battle, and that battle actually was at New Orleans. Andrew Jackson stripped Winchester of a lot of troops and supplies. Winchester had about 10,000 troops, but only a third of them, according to the research, were armed. And the battle itself at New Orleans actually took part from January the 8th until the 18th of 1812. And if you know your history, it was really, shouldn't have been fought at all, because the United States and Britain had declared the war at an end at the Treaty of Ghent, in December 24th, 1813. So we were at peace with Great Britain.
1815.
Or 1813, 14. And the battle was fought after the two countries were supposed to be at peace. It was an overwhelming victory for Jackson. He didn't lose very many casualties, but it was a resounding defeat for Pickenham and the British forces. They had brought their troops in. They had just recently defeated Napoleon. They had the cream of their troops there, and they thought they were going to overrun the American forces, and they didn't. They lost a lot of men. That kind of enraged the...
Winchester wasn't at New Orleans.
No, he wasn't there, but
no.
But he was in that area around the Gulf. And like I said, most of the forces went to Andrew Jackson. When he was in charge of Fort Boyer, and if I had a bigger map, it would be, here's the Mobile Bay, and there's a long finger that sticks out, and Fort Boyer was at the tip of this finger. You can see the design of the fort. And Andrew Jackson told Winchester, said, you defend this with all, I don't want you to lose this fort. He said, you've got 10,000.
Well, he had a reputation of losing, yeah.
He said that in Jackson's opinion, it would take 10,000 men to take this fort. Well, the British had attacked the fort in February of previously in the year, and unsuccessful. But they did find out the flaw. It had a weakness. Right here, the back side, all the fences were, the big guns were pointing out to sea to take on the ships. The weak point was right here. And they came in from the land side and captured Fort Boyer. And again, Winchester had to surrender. But he basically says that he didn't have the troops. And Andrew Jackson, he said, it only took me 3,500 Tennesseans to beat the British, and you had more than that on your force. Okay. Only trouble, Winchester didn't have his men weren't armed.
There is a difference, isn't there?
Yes, there is.
So this is his third surrender.
Right.
And how long was he incarcerated this time?
He wasn't incarcerated.
He wasn't even incarcerated?
No.
Okay.
So that's the 3 times that he was captured by the British. You can see his military career was quite extensive. For 40-some years, he served his country and the states of Maryland and Tennessee. He started out as a private in a flying company. He ends up as a U.S. Brigadier General. That's his highest rank. He has some problems, though.
What did he do after the War of 1812? How much longer did he live?
Oh, he lived until 1826.
So he lived about 10 more years, right?
Yes, 10 more years. But he resigned his commission.
Okay, and became a civilian.
He became a civilian, and he tried to vindicate his name and his military career. And both Harrison and Andrew Jackson had political ideas. They wanted to become president of the United States, and they didn't want to be associated with him and see if anything could rub off on them because of their incompetency of supplies or whatever else. And he goes to Andrew Jackson, which is somewhat of his friends. He says, Andrew says that you're no longer a military man, so I can't take you into a military court and give you a trial.
He couldn't have the trial then in the military court. How could he vindicate himself?
Oh, he wrote a series of papers, and he tried to talk to anybody that listened. Basically, that he wasn't as bad as an officer as what you thought he was. He tried to vindicate himself that way, but he didn't have much traction.
Did he play any role at all in the early development of Tennessee then, after the War of 1812?
Basic.
Ooh, that's the house we saw before, huh?
Yeah, that's the house what it is today. It's been fully restored. It was restored in 1962, and you can go through that house. But Winchester himself, this is in the middle of the Cumberland Valley, and he had carried on quite a bit of commerce. When he arrived in that location, he was close to the Mississippi River, and he would trade in New Orleans. And he ran a flour mill, a sawmill, distillery.
Good Tennessee whiskey, huh?
Oh yeah, yeah. He was a partner and stockholder in a cotton and cloth factory, and he also was one of the early people to see that the merit of using steamboats on the Mississippi River as trade and such like this. So and commerce-wise, he did really well. He was a good businessman, but may not have been as good a soldier.
Okay.
But that's basically the story. It's a beautiful house, and I guess that pretty much wraps us up.
Now, he was only in our community for the building of the fort.
About 3 months.
About 3 months, and then has had a career which has not been too favorable. So really his role in our community, other than he supplied lumber for our pioneers, what was it, once again, what was the activity that took place at Fort Winchester?
Basically a forward outpost and supply depot. Until Fort Meigs was constructed, that's where most of the battles took place. I know we did the research. There was a Colonel Johnson that was credited with killing Tecumseh. Johnson brought in his mounted Kentucky troops here at Fort Winchester and actually trained his troops and his horses that they could fire on a mounted horse without the horse reacting to it. And it was a staging ground for the rest of the war.
Now, I was told once that at Fort Winchester they assembled the supplies that came up the Auglaize for Fort Meigs, and then in pirogues or flatboats or rafts,
Right.
took them up and resupplied Fort Meigs, right?
Right. There was a Greene was another Kentucky general, came up here during the siege of Fort Meigs. They met here at the confluence. They had like 1,800 soldiers and 12 flat-bottom boats, and they left the confluence or Fort Winchester and went to Fort Meigs from here. It was more or less a supply depot. It goes into mind-boggling the number of supplies that are
Went through.
meals and stuff that were prepared here, cartridges and such.
The other thing that I've heard is that when Winchester first came here, he looked at Fort Defiance, and it was in such disrepair that he chose not to do anything with it, but he built a embankment and a small fortification until Harrison showed up and commanded Robb to build Fort Winchester.
Well, it was like a sentry post or something they could see down the rivers.
Mm-hmm. Right. And was there a stockade, you think, involved?
No. See, the one thing that if you study Winchester, he follows Anthony Wayne's example of how they worked in this area. Every night, be it 12 miles or 10 miles away from their previous camp, they would drop the trees and build an embankment or a wall at least 4 foot high of the trees. And some of these camps were so large that they could put 1,200 men, all their supplies and livestock with inside them. So they've been building structures all this time. There was at what we call White's Mills,
Yeah.
where the old 24 and the railroad tracks. There was a camp there with the walls like this. And camp number 2, well, actually camp number 1 was located where the Tiffin River comes into the The Maumee, that was a similar thing.
Yeah.
There was at least 4-foot walls where they could gather within to defend themselves, and camp number 2 and number 3 were the same. So these guys were, like the British said, they'd never seen people so handy with an axe. They could cut these trees down and stack them up, and that's one thing he didn't do. Basically in Frenchtown, if he would have followed that through, and the 17th U.S. Infantry would have put up a stockade around themselves, they wouldn't have been overrun.
Yeah. Well, is Winchester a true hero, or is Winchester just somebody that passes through our community? And was he a noble soldier and an outstanding statesman? And I don't have the slightest idea. I'll leave that up to you. And I've spent 60-some years trying to figure it out. I hope you get your answer quicker than I have.